this is a very pain area in scalability. So this is the same thing that we have in here. Also, we talk about availability. Availability is one of the most important concept in any infrastructure. What is the availability of your system? Now, typically we need 100% availability, but that's not possible. So any product or any project that you see, all the clients will have an SLA of 99.99 or 99.999%. So this is how it actually works. So if you work in the Azure SLA also, Microsoft will give you an SLA of 99.995%. So if you consider into an hours, so this will be 8,760 hours a year. Microsoft also supports. Now, for an on-premises server, the more uptime for the SLA requires, the higher the cost. Then we have support. So what is the support? So think of it like this. You're creating your physical data center. Now you say that I want to get all my products from Dell, or I want to get all my products from HP, or you want to say that I will create my own data center. So how will you get the support? If you buy everything from Dell or if you buy everything from HP, initially if you buy a hardware, they will give you a free support for 2, 3 years or 5 years. But of course, you cannot get away with all of your physical hardware after 5 years and create a new system. That will increase the cost multifold. So after 5 years, you again have to buy or renew your support licensing with the specific vendor. That's something, again, a cost that we have to keep in mind. Multilingual support is something that we have in not just on-premises SQL Server. We have to include this in our cloud journey as well. So in on-premises, what happens is multilingual support is something that we decide on the basis of our collation level on the SQL Server. So if you have a non-English speaking data or a user set, then we have to keep this in mind that we have to have multiple servers, because one database can have only one collation. That's also something we have to keep in mind. And finally, we come to the TCO, or the total cost of ownership. So in terms of TCO, or the total cost of ownership, we have to keep all these things in mind: the hardware, the software licensing, the labor, that means the installation, upgrade and maintenance, and the data center overhead, where you have to include your power consumption, your telecommunication, building cost, your heating cost, your cooling cost. So this is something that becomes pretty exhaustive when you think about the actual usage. So this is something that we call as capex, or capital expenditure. Now again, I'm going a bit into this because this is something that is required when we deal with our solutioning, like how should we create it. Because smaller organization like startups and all, it's very difficult to go for this kind of capex, because this is something that you have to keep upfront before you start your business. On top of it, we have opex, which is the operational expenditure, which is continuous part of your project or your organization. So these are some of the costs that we have in an on-premises system. Now, if we have to consider the same cost from a cloud perspective, what benefits do we have? When we think about the cloud environment, the compute environment. So in this case, first and foremost, we completely eliminate the concept of capex. Since cloud environment is completely virtualized, we don't have to bother about any kind of physical or logical hardware, because these are all logical infrastructure. So if you want, you can just say that I want to create a virtual machine where I want to have this much of RAM and all these things, and it's a pay-as-you-go model. Microsoft will not say that, okay, give me the upfront licensing for your OS, give me the upfront licensing for your SQL Server. They will create a bundle product for you, and it's a pay-as-you-go model. So Microsoft will say that if you use this for 1 hour, we're going to charge you this much. If you use it for 1 day, we're going to charge you this much. So there is no capex involved in a computing environment. Okay, so this is very, very important and very flexible in terms of capital expenditure. Now, I'm not going to too much of these details. I'm going to share this document. You can see this and read through this. It talks about different Azure services. I'm not going to talk about the Azure services now. I'm going to talk about them a little later. What is a blob storage and what is a disk storage. Maintenance. Again, since you don't own any physical hardware, you don't have to bother about the maintenance. It's completely part of the CSP. So Microsoft will manage your physical hardware, your networking, your firewalls, your network security, fault tolerant, compliance, physical security. All these things are managed by Microsoft. You don't have to worry about any of the administrative jobs. All the GDPRs, the policies. Of course, you as a user have the flexibility to create your own policy, but the GDPR policies, the physical data center, so the cooling and the networking. When I say networking, I mean to say the internet. All these things are part of your cost. You don't have to pay anything extra for that. Scalability. This is by far the most important concept in cloud computing is scalability. The problem that we talked about in a typical on-premises scalability is a piece of cake in cloud. When we work with the hands-on, you will see that the same problem that I explained in the physical SQL server. If I am choking for memory, if I'm short of hard disk space, it's just a click of a button in cloud. You can just click and you can quickly upscale. If you feel that, okay, I don't need this much of memory, I don't need this much of space, you can again click a button and you can downscale. So it's very, very simple in the cloud infrastructure, the scalability. And then availability. Of course, since it is backed up by Microsoft has SLA for all of their products. So the minimum SLA that you're going to see for any Azure product is 99.99%. There are some products which has more than that as well. So you don't have to bother about your availability. Okay, another thing I should mention about availability is that this is a very good concept, and this is a practical thing that we have seen in our day-to-day lives also. 2-3 years back, there was a physical outage in one of Microsoft's data centers. It was, if I'm not wrong, it was in Florida or somewhere, where there was an earthquake fire in one of their data centers. So a lot of Azure resources went down. Now, this is a very practical scenario, because physical calamities or natural calamities nobody can predict and nobody can prevent. So there was a fire, there was an earthquake, and there was a fire in Microsoft's data center. So a lot of Azure services went down. But when I say went down, I mean to say that still these products were available, but they had a limited resources. It was a bit slow. But think of it that if this happens in a physical data center, if you have a physical data center, if you own that physical data center, I sincerely hope not, but if something happens in that, if your data center is gone, all of your data is gone. Or you have to physically manage a backup of that data, so the cost again increase. Then how did Microsoft manage this? So what happens is, folks, please keep this in mind. Whenever you create any resource on Azure, I'm again gonna revisit this topic, just an introduction here. Microsoft makes backup of your data and they store it in different physical data centers. That is also part of your cost of the product that you buy from Microsoft. But Microsoft does not disclose this backup to you. It's managed by Microsoft. Why Microsoft does is that Microsoft has a SLA of 99.99%. Now, in this case, if there is a physical fire in the data center, how does Microsoft maintain the SLA? So part of their SLA, they always take a backup of your resource. It's just that it's managed internally by Microsoft so that they can maintain the SLA. So your availability is again taken care in cloud. And then finally, we have support for anything that you do. If you're facing any issues, you can reach out to Microsoft. You can create a support ticket and you have somebody to point to whenever there is an issue, and also the multilingual support. So the total cost of ownership in this case is very, very less compared to your traditional on-premises system. You can just buy an Azure subscription. Based on that, what all products you need, you can just create these products and you can get started with a pay-as-you-go model. If you need to increase your stack, if you need to upscale, you can do that. If you don't need, you can downscale. Another important concept is that in Azure, you can even pause your systems. So think of it from an ETL perspective, that you have a data warehouse. Now this data warehouse, of course, in a data warehouse, we have a latency. So maybe this data warehouse runs a job and populates the data every day. So out of 24 hours, this data warehouse will be operational for, maybe 6 hours or 8 hours. So if you buy a SQL server, you have already paid everything. But in case of Azure, you can even pause this data warehouse so that you can save a lot of money. These things are also possible in Azure. Finally, we have the lift and shift. So the lift and shift, I'm gonna just explain a bit because we're gonna have a hands-on with this one. Very common term you're gonna hear in the Azure world is lift and shift. Lift and shift is nothing but moving or migrating your on-premises to Azure. So there are a lot of tools which are available from Microsoft and third-party tools to help you with this lift and shift. So think of it that you have a physical machine from where you want to move to a virtual machine. So if you want to migrate from a physical machine to a virtual machine, we call it as a lift and shift. Now, of course, there are certain prerequisites that we have to keep in mind. Another example would be if you have a traditional SQL server, from a traditional on-premises SQL server, you want to move to a Azure SQL. So you can perform a lift and shift because you don't want to lose your existing data. You don't want to lose your existing application which you're using. You just want to switch it when you move to Azure.